First, I want to welcome all of you. I'm here, and it is so great to see all of you in the auditorium with us. I want to agree with our dean that I believe this is the beginning of a year-long discussion and conversation that we're going to have about the events that we all have witnessed in the last several days. It's amazing to me to think that in 9 days, it'll be 20 years since the attacks of 9/11. I remember those attacks very well. I remember how we came together as a community the day after here at Fletcher. It was, of course, those attacks that caused the U.S. to intervene in Afghanistan. 2 days ago, President Biden brought to an end that U.S. intervention. So with those 2 days as bookends, I'm delighted to introduce to you 3 of our faculty who are going to begin this year-long discussion with all of us. So with us tonight, we have Professor Monica Toft. She is Professor of International Politics and Director of the Center for Strategic Studies here at Fletcher. We have Professor Chris Miller. He is Professor of International History, and he also is co-director of Fletcher's Russia and Eurasia. And there she is on the screen, Professor Ayesha Jalal, who is Mary Richardson Professor of History at Tufts, and also a member of our Fletcher faculty. So what I've asked is for each of our panelists to make about 10 or 15 minutes of comments about the most recent events and to add some context to it. I may, as the chair, exercise my option to ask them a question or two about what they have to say. And then we will open this for discussion, both from all of you and from those who are joining us virtually through Zoom. Now, I have only one request. Here at Fletcher, and you've already probably learned this, we tackle the toughest, the most complex and difficult issues. And in doing so, we often passionately disagree with each other. But we do so by agreeing to disagree and not to be disagreeable to one another. And that's our way. You know, it's the Fletcher family, Fletcher Mafia, Fletcher Tribe. It's our way. So with that, I'm going to ask my good friend and colleague, Monica Toft, to begin our discussion.
And it's really fabulous to see everybody in the room. It's funny, my glasses are fogging up and we were talking about the fog of war. My job to start here is to sort of try to help us to understand how we got into this morass in Afghanistan. And it's been an extraordinary calamity, a tragedy for many, for some in this room. And one of the big comments I'm going to make is I think, unfortunately, it wasn't enough of a tragedy for many Americans. So I'm going to make 7 points, and I'm a data junkie. If you take any of my classes, you're going to see that. And I'm going to run through each of the 7 points, ending with sort of a philosophical, ethical, pragmatic question at the end. So the first point, trying to understand how we got to where we are today, 20 years of war, 10 days of evacuation that was quite messy. It probably didn't need to be as messy, but I have news for you, evacuations are messy. The British lost 4,700 when they pulled out in the 19th century. We lost 13 troops, and then, of course, Afghan citizens. So the 4 I's is how I think we got into this morass. The first one is inertia, right? And I remember when I got married, my father said to me, you better be sure, because it's easier to get married than it is to get divorced. Right? And my father was right. I'm still married, not because it's more expensive, but because I still love my husband. Yep, no, we have two lovely children, and yesterday I just put them both here. They're jumbos. My son is his second year, and my daughter is first year. But in any event, this explains why 3 prior administrations didn't pull out. It's difficult. It's politically difficult, right? And you can see President Biden right now is really getting beat up, and the Republicans, the people who are opposed to him, are sort of being quite hypocritical about how difficult procedure this is to extricate yourself from a 20-year war. So one is inertia. It's just that basic. That's why we're there for 20 years. A second is ignorance, right? And you're at the Fletcher School, and I'm hoping that you're less ignorant. Most Americans have forgotten and do not know about the broader history of war, how brutal it is. It's a brutish enterprise. This is why Thomas Hobbes wrote about being nasty and brutish. And the U.S. over-reliance on the use of force. Right? And you can think about Eisenhower warning us in 1961, he's handing over government to President Kennedy, and had Kennedy lived, he was going to try to abide by some of the teachings that were in Eisenhower's speech about an informed citizenry and trying to sort of not let the military-industrial complex get away with sort of perverting our politics and our policy. And political scientist Philip Converse said, the 2 simplest truths I know about the distribution of political information is that moderate electorates are that the mean is low and the variance is high. And I think when it comes to national security, I think the mean is probably even lower and the variance is even higher, right? So this leads to my second I after inertia, ignorance, and the third is indifference, or we could even say disinterest. Most Americans don't care about politics and policy. You guys are exceptional. And among the issues they care about, we know it's not foreign policy, and if it is foreign policy, it's definitely not national security policy. They tend to care about poor government and leadership. Right now, currently 34% of Americans are there, followed by immigration, 13%, and then sort of a lumped category of economic issues, 11%. And in fact, Gallup polls show that consistently most Americans believe that the U.S. does not even need to be a primary actor, right? Just a major actor in international affairs. They don't need to be a leader. Yet, in Washington, people talk about the blob. There's a sense among some of the elite, and I would say the elite that perhaps no longer that control the reins, that we need to be the leader out there. Those who believe we should take the lead in international affairs are only 23%. Right? So the majority of Americans believe that we should play a major role, but we don't necessarily always have to play the leading role. Nevertheless, when asked about foreign policy, there are some critical distinctions. So beyond the hawks, those are people who believe that we have to have more engagement, major engagement, and more military spending. That's about 20%. That's 1 in 5. And then there's doves, which is less engagement and less military spending. That's 18%. So they're about equal. So there isn't a lot of consensus, right? Because there's that really fat middle of 60% that says maybe we need some engagement and maybe we need a little less engagement. And so the good news is that we might be able to persuade some of them that the U.S. does not need to be engaging the way it has been and can be a little bit more smart about it. So the last I is the American capacity to have ignored this conflict, right? So just ignoring it. In general terms, I know it was costly for some of you in this room, for your families and friends, but for the American polity, it was not, which is why we're a wealthy nation. We could let it lag and hang on for 20 years. And just to give you some comparative data, Vietnam, the American polity, we lost 58,209 servicemen and women. 304,000 were wounded, 2.7 million Americans served. That's out of a population of 210 million. That hurt. In Afghanistan, we have 2,400 dead, 21,000 wounded, and 800,000 served out of a population of 333 million, right? We spent $2 trillion, but in the grand scheme of things, a lot of Americans did not feel the pain of Afghanistan. So that was point number 1, right? That Americans just do not appreciate the nastiness of the war. They were able to ignore it. Point number 2, if you could put up the first slide, is this what I talk about, this hubris humility index. Where's the slides? Oh, here. So America is a very hubristic nation, and what we need to do is have more humility. So you guys are going to be learning lots of facts and figures as we go through, but it turns out that our policymakers are not sort of learning these facts and figures as much. I'm going to stand up for this. So this slide, can you put it in a slideshow view? So what this is showing you is that over time, great powers and major powers, we're talking about a power differential of 10-1, have been losing more and more over time. So in the 19th century, from 1800 to 1850 about, they were prevailing. So great powers, this 10-1 differential against an enemy, they were winning 9 of 10 of their battles. By the 1950s, it's half and half. It's become much more difficult to compel an enemy that we're intervening upon to win. It's just much more difficult. Nationalism is rife, and then also the lack of commitment by the population. So interventions are just much more difficult to make work. They extend conflicts, right? And we, the United States, is often the aggressor in these conflicts. So that's point 2, right? We need to be more humble about what we think we can achieve. And the data here are really clear. In the 20th century and now in the 21st century, it's really difficult to win and prevail on the battlefield. Not impossible, but quite difficult. So you want to be careful about getting married to a war. Point 3, can you go to the next slide? These wars have caused U.S. power and influence to be quite diminished. We were seen as something to be emulated, but since the global war on terror, of which Afghanistan was sort of the mother of all battles, you can see that the United States is now seen as a major threat because we moved from Afghanistan to Iraq to Syria to Yemen to, Africa now. We have AFRICOM. So the United States is now seen as a major threat around the world. This is not good for our reputation. If we're trying to sort of prevail and have national interests secured, or just be a good guy on the block, right, and help other nations to achieve better livelihoods and better lives, the United States is not trusted as much as it used to be. So let's go to the next slide, point 4. The U.S. has ramped up its confrontations. What this slide is showing you is the level of hostility that the United States uses in its confrontations with opponents. So you can see in the early parts of the founding of the nation, when it was trying to get established, trying to get away from the British and sort of open up its frontier through the part of the 19th century, the United States has been resorting to much higher uses of force and the threat of the use of force in the more contemporary era. And that's worrisome, right? This is at a time, particularly in the post-Cold War period, where there really was, you could argue about China becoming a peer competitor. It's not yet militarily, economically, it might be becoming, but in terms of the use of force, the United States is basically relying on it much more so than in earlier eras. And that's worrisome because it's in a period where we actually don't have a peer competitor. So let's go to point 5, the next slide. So, is America a bully? And when these data, so this data is based on the Military Intervention Project, which some of you have contributed to. A lot of Masters of Law Diplomacy students were the research assistants on this, and we've collected data on every intervention the U.S. has conducted. There's about 500 of them. And what's really worrisome is this gap. So you see as our opponents are sort of de-escalating, trying to de-escalate the fight, the United States is pushing it up. Right? And using warfare, going to war, actually using force, not just threatening force, but actually using force. And that gap has been increasing. I really hope, I pray that President Biden understands this and says it's time to not rely on force. How about some diplomacy, right? The Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. So let's go to point 6, next slide. And we're doing this at a time when our opponents have less and less that we're fighting for. So one of the big debates that's happening right now about this 20-year struggle in Afghanistan is, what actually were we fighting for? Yes, we had a very compelling reason to be there, right? Trying to get rid of al-Qaeda, right? And the Taliban support for that. But our compelling reason to stay there kept morphing. So if you look at this is what we were fighting for over time. You can see as it gets lighter, that means that the interest, the income, the resources, the populations that we were trying to sort of control reduced over time. So we're upping the use of force at a time that we're going after fewer and fewer resources. So let's go to point 7. And this is my philosophical question. This is a project out of the costs of war. Here we are right now in higher education, right? We are facing real trade-offs in what we can spend our money on. So for every $1 million spent, right, you can create almost 20 jobs in elementary and secondary school compared to 7 jobs in federal defense. And so as Americans, but I think also this military industrial complex is not just an American problem. We've helped to explore it. If you take my class, we're going to read some really good articles about it, about the use of that as influence. But these are really sort of the bread and butter, right? Guns and butter kind of debates that we need to be having about where we want our tax dollars to go and have them spent responsibly. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Dick.
Well, Monica, the only question I really would have for you is that when you look back on Afghanistan, many say that this was a war of necessity, not a war of choice. What do you think of that?
I do think it was a war of necessity. I think when we went in originally in 2001 after 9/11, look, the American homeland was attacked. We knew where the insurgency came from. We knew where the attacks came from. And so I do think that that was right. The problem is, Dick, that once we sort of routed the Taliban, we were able to do that, get, Al-Qaeda sort of push. The problem is that we didn't finish the job. The Bush administration got distracted. We're still trying to figure out why. Right?
By a war of choice.
By a war of choice. So the war of necessity could have been finished much more readily and handily, right, if we had not gotten distracted. And then we could have turned to diplomacy, really put pressure on Pakistan, really thought about our intelligence more so, and then thought about economics and sanctions, right? But the problem is that we kept thinking in the military mindset. So first we did do a pretty good job of routing, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda initially. Then we turned and put our focus on Iraq. And then we went back and then we started thinking, wow, we've got a nation build and do all this other stuff along the way. We really lost our way. So it started as a war of necessity. And then I think it became sort of an occupation of choice without really thinking through what is it that we can achieve? How can we achieve it? And by the way, is the use of force, military might, the best way to go? And that was where I think we made our mistake.
Okay. Well, maybe we can come back to Pakistan.
Sure.
Their role for Ayesha Jalal. But first, Chris, it's over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Dick, for moderating this discussion. Thanks, Monica, for kicking us off with a bunch of, I think, good questions to ask. I thought I could turn my attention away from the United States' view of the war, which I think is obviously an important question, especially this week, and put it in a bit of a broader regional perspective. First of all, for the United States, the war is, or at least might be over. We'll see how things develop. For Afghanistan itself and for the region, the war is far from over and it might just be accelerating. And I think the first thing that I would like to suggest, and I suggest this as a historian who is trying already to understand how historians tell the story of what's happening, what has happened, is that we talk about, at least in the United States, we talk about the war in Afghanistan. But I think it's really easy to see a series of wars over the past really 40 years in Afghanistan, and we can't really understand how we got to where we are today without looking at how those different conflicts have developed. They've involved different actors, there's been different levels of violence over time. Some of them have been mostly focused on Afghanistan, others have been regional struggles with external actors playing a larger role. But I think we need to think in the mindset not of the war in Afghanistan, when did it start, is it over yet, but rather how the wars and the conflicts in Afghanistan have changed over time. And even when you look at the U.S. Intervention in Afghanistan, which, as Dick mentioned in his opening comments, is now 20 years old, I think you can see multiple wars in Afghanistan there too. If you look at U.S. military operations, they've had different goals over time. The number of U.S. forces in Afghanistan has changed really drastically over time. And the amount of commitment in terms of casualties have also changed really drastically over time as well, which I think speaks in part to Monica's point about how the American people did feel the costs of the war. Well, certainly not of the most recent couple of years where casualties have been quite low. There's been a financial cost, but not a cost in terms of casualties, particularly in comparison to about a decade ago when the fighting of U.S. forces was most intense. And of course, we've actually seen an increase in casualties in the Afghan army over that time period. So it's not to say the war has wound down for other people fighting the war, have changed over time. And I think this categorization or periodization of the war or the wars matters a lot, because when you're trying to assess cause and effect, and when you're trying to assess the impact of different groups, you got to understand which war or wars were they fighting in. And from the U.S. perspective, we were only participants really in a handful of those wars. There was fighting in Afghanistan in the 1990s, which the U.S. mostly ignored. There was fighting in Afghanistan in the 1980s, far bloodier than the past couple of decades has seen, which the U.S. was involved in as well in a very different way. But when you put all of this together, I think the question of is the war in Afghanistan over looks like the wrong question to be asking. And even the question of why did the war in Afghanistan begin begs the question of, well, which conflict are we speaking about? And so I'd like to encourage all of you. It's one thing I think it's inevitable that when we open the front page of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the perspective from the United States is that the U.S. government's war is over. Maybe that's true, but I think the thesis that the conflict is over is, of course, completely false. And it's worth putting that at the front of our analysis of what's going on. I think it's also worth us asking whether the U.S. intervention is actually over. I think there are plenty of periods in the past couple of decades where U.S. political leaders would have liked to declare victory, and at certain times did declare victory, only to see a couple of years later that the U.S. was back involved again. I think Iraq is another example that I think people won't like to make that comparison, but I think it probably is a potential comparison for how the U.S. government will relate to Afghanistan in the future. The U.S. has declared it's in Iraq multiple times now, and yet in different ways, the U.S. is still engaged. And so I would caution us from concluding that the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan is actually over. I think we're certainly in a new phase. There's no doubt about that, but I'm not so sure that in 5 years' time, in this room, we'll be having a conversation about the war in Afghanistan or the U.S. war in Afghanistan that ended 5 years ago. I think for better or for worse, that might be a premature conclusion to draw. A third and final point I'd like to suggest is that in addition to thinking about the consequences of the Taliban takeover for Afghanistan, which will obviously be immense, assuming that in fact the Taliban is able to establish an effective government, I think we'll see to what extent that actually materializes. The impact in the broader region will also be extraordinary important. And it's not just the countries that directly border Afghanistan, although they certainly will be impacted. Countries like Pakistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Iran. Afghanistan has a lot of countries that it borders, and almost all of them will be impacted. But it's beyond that, because the refugee flows that we're already seeing out of Afghanistan will impact a far larger array of countries. I was talking to an acquaintance today in Turkey, which does not border Afghanistan at all, but is already preparing for refugee flows. And I think Turkey is going to be far from the only country whose domestic politics will be impacted by refugee flows. They'll have to find a way to organize the receipt of refugees from Afghanistan. And so the impacts on third countries are going to be immense. And in the U.S. conversation about how we ended the war in Afghanistan, to do it the right way or not, it's very easy to lose the impact on the war on third countries. And of course, the fact that the war is still going on in Afghanistan in a new form, but the fighting still continues, means that refugee flows will also continue as well. So I'll pause there with those three comments at the table. Looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Chris, you make some very interesting points, and I want to just comment briefly on the second one, because it is the case that the U.S. did withdraw from Iraq, only to re-intervene because of the conditions that followed that exit. And I think you're right that the U.S. may have withdrawn from Afghanistan, but that it sees itself still engaged in Afghanistan in a new way is a fact. And it is evolving literally as we speak because of the way that they view Afghanistan through the counterterrorist lens. So very interesting observations. Thank you for them. And now we'll go to Professor Jalal. Is your mic on?
Yes, thank you so much, Dick, and thank you for having me on this panel. The danger of going.
You're just back from Pakistan.
Sorry?
I say thank you for doing this because
well, the disadvantage of being the last one on the panel is that you sound like you're saying the same things in a different way. But at that risk, I'll say that I was asked to comment, to basically make some observations. And I think one of the main observations to be made, at least in the way this whole event is being, this withdrawal is being covered, is that it's presentist and wholly American-centered. And while that's understandable, I think it's extremely short-sighted. I think, as Professor Miller has mentioned, this may have been a 20-year war for America, but for Afghans and also their neighbors, it has lasted inconclusively for over 42 years and is set to continue for much, much longer. An exclusive focus on the US military withdrawal, as has been the case, does not adequately ask the perennial question, which I think Professor Toft raised, but then also agreed that it was the right decision. The perennial question of what America was doing there in the first place, and whether decisions taken after the 9/11 attacks were well thought through or perhaps even appropriate. And I think that's a question that needs to be debated for many, many years to come to draw some epistemic conclusions for shifts in our thinking of how to handle world affairs. And I would say that that should be the primary concern that we should have after this overly long war, which seems to have been bookended with one tragedy, starting, with an event that happened 20 years ago on 9/11, and another one that ended with the death of 90 Afghans and 13 American servicemen. Questions need to be asked, and they need to be asked, really sort of critically and without sort of pulling any punches. Questions are being asked even in Pakistan, from where I have just returned, and where amid the staged triumphalism apparent in ministerial ranks, at least some ministerial ranks of the incumbent government, there is a recognition, even by the all-powerful military and its intelligence wings, that the American withdrawal is at best a mixed blessing. The so-called Taliban are not taking marching orders from Islamabad or GHQ, while another wave of refugees is not only on the cards, but threatens an already sagging economy with dire consequences. And as for those who are sidelined in Pakistan's military-dominated state, they are alarmed, not because of what is happening in Afghanistan only, but what augurs for Pakistan. Because those who are amongst the triumphalist elements include those who would not just like to tell the Taliban what to do, but would like to see repeat in Pakistan what the Taliban achieved some years ago, with disastrous implications for women and just about everything else, for freedom of thought. So there is grave apprehension about the implications of the Taliban takeover, if it can be called that. So the question that really has to be asked is whether history will repeat itself, or if the major actors, in which I include Pakistan, Iran, and many of the Central Asian countries, from their past mistakes. Time will, of course, tell. The Taliban regime, if it does manage to establish authority, which is a big question mark, and can govern, will have to reckon with not just armed rivals who are formidable and are backed by different regional powers, but also the aspirations of the Afghan middle class, which is now estimated to be 10 to 15% of Afghanistan's population. That may be the one factor that is different from Afghanistan of 2001. The future of Afghanistan, no doubt, has to be decided by the Afghans themselves, not just by the so-called Taliban. And ignoring that will not just mean havoc for the country, but also for its regional neighbors and indeed for global security as a whole. And I think I'll just stop there, Dick, and take questions.
Ayesha, you began by saying that the whole question of the intervention needs to be rethought.
Well, I think that's what Monica Toft was saying in her. Just to some extent, that's exactly what she's saying. That if you are going to abandon diplomacy, we're sitting in a diplomacy school, and if we are just going to single-mindedly use military force without looking at the consequences of that, and I think the Afghan war is the perfect example of where IR goes wrong, or security studies goes wrong, because the overwhelming emphasis is on military, and that's what you've got. What have you got out of Afghanistan?
No, I understand your point. My question to you is, when the 9/11 attack occurred, what choice did Washington have but to go to war?
Washington's choice was
They haven't decided to go to war.
well. Let me try and answer that. I myself thought that hard diplomacy and more time was needed than going in, but I think that I understand why it was done. It was for domestic political reasons. But unfortunately, domestic political choices are resulting in unintended consequences for future generations of politicians who can't handle them. So I think this needs to be factored into any discussion of security in this country in the future. I mean, you can cater to domestic policy. And as Monica pointed out, that there is a disjunction between domestic policy and foreign policy. There's a need to bring those together, much more so. And I don't think that was the case with the Afghanistan war. And the lesson to be taken here is precisely that you will potentially have those tantalizing opportunities again. And you need to see what can be accomplished. So, I mean, yes, you went and knocked them out. The Taliban disappeared into the woodworks, as we all realized, and then they came back. So I just think that has to be thought through epistemically of what needs to be done. I'm not saying that military options are always wrong, but in the case of Afghanistan, I just don't see what was accomplished in these 20 years. And I think that's what America has to think about very deeply.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we now have time for some questions from all of you, and then we're going to take some questions from Zoom. And I guess the way we're going to do this is, oh, I don't have this thing. I guess the way we're going to do this is I'll ask you someone to raise their hand. Right here. So please stand up and ask the question to either Professor Toft, Professor Miller, or Professor Jalal.
Hello, everyone. My question has to do with looking into the near future. From what is left of the Doha agreement between the Taliban and the United States, there was some type of agreement on counterterrorism cooperation with the Taliban. What would that look like? What does that actually mean on the ground, given that U.S. forces and allies have withdrawn? The relation between Pakistan and ISI, I mean, it continues to shift. What does it mean to the 22 other international terrorist networks in Afghanistan that are active? Thank you.
Who wants to answer?
Well, I mean, the U.S. Department of Defense has said that they are willing to.
Question.
Yes. So the question is so Doha. Part of the agreement was that the United States would work with the Taliban, right, in counterterrorism efforts. And we know that ISIS-K, Farzan, is active in Afghanistan, and they took responsibility for the tragic attack that resulted in 13 American service members. And Ayesha, I thought the number was up to 140 of Afghans who were killed in that tragic event. And DoD just yesterday did say that they would be willing to work with the Taliban. And what's so striking about that, this is a classic case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, is that we see this. So I study religion and global politics, and I talk about the ratchet effect of religion once it gets involved in a war. And what happens is that it gets more and more extreme. It ratchets up. And what's so striking in this case is that the Taliban now are seen as the moderates, right? Whereas ISIS-K is, gloves off. And the Taliban are actually saying, perhaps we will. And the big question mark there is, will the Taliban work effectively, honestly, openly, and truthfully with the United States? And will the United States hold their feet to the fire to do so, right? Because the Taliban's nervous about ISIS-K, right? It wants to be able to govern, and there's a big question about whether it's going to be able to take the reins of state, much less run them. Have them respect basic human rights in that country. And that's the big question mark, will the Taliban? And why it's difficult is that the Taliban has premised its ideas, its ideology on a very extremist, fundamentalist form of Islam. And one of the reasons why ISIS-K has followers is that the Taliban was willing to talk to the West, right? So in terms of trying to balance the interests, the Taliban also has a domestic constituency that it needs to satisfy. Otherwise, it's afraid that it's going to have recruits go over to ISIS-K. And then, of course, the United States needs to get something and some assurances and we're just not sure there yet. And I think the American DoD is signaling, yeah, we might be willing to work with you, but it's not going to be a blank check here. And so the question is what kind of leverage we will have on the Taliban to help with this counterterrorism operation.
Yeah, I would just add that the Taliban probably is very happy to have American help against ISIS. The question that DoD will ask is, what about some of those other groups? Chris mentioned that there are at least one, but one in particular. How about them? So it's going to be interesting to see, and my own view is I don't hold out much hope for such cooperation, but we'll see. We have who has a second question? Yes, well.
Thanks. Do you think the lesson of a reliance on special operations forces and more unmanned over-the-horizon responses is the correct answer to continuing threats, or is that leaning on a way of war that's become politically acceptable for us? Is that really sustainable, both politically and militarily?
The question was about the reliance on special operations forces and over-the-horizon methods of counterterrorism. I think there's an interesting historical pattern, which is not necessarily a positive pattern, but an interesting pattern to note, which is that whenever a military operation goes wrong, you tack to the opposite direction and try to fight the last war or the next conflict. And I think there's probably going to be that dynamic here as well, where there's a lot of people who have drawn the conclusion that nation building doesn't work, that large footprint operations don't work, and so that the opposite will work. And I think in the DoD mindset, that does mean wide footprint special operations style forces. Whether that's the right lesson to draw, I'm not so sure. I mean, I don't know that there's a single right lesson that one would apply in every context, and nor is it obvious that DoD is the answer to every problem that we've got. But I think we can say historically that there's an impulse one always has to try to draw a single lesson from a prior conflict and apply the opposite strategy in the next conflict and hope that it delivers better results.
So there's a practical problem with relying on special operations forces, and I'm sure some of you are sitting in this room. They are really spectacular, intelligent, specialized people, right? And a society doesn't produce a lot of them. So to become a Navy SEAL, only 1 in 4 is accepted into the program, and only 1 in 3 make it through the program, right? So think about that. So the idea that we're going to be able to rely on special operators to help us combat our enemies, abroad, I think we have to think long and hard about whether we actually have the capacity to do that given the personnel in the service. So this is just a very practical thing. The other thing, Laura, is that what's worrisome is I remember going and visiting Skunk Works. You guys know what Skunk Works is, a DoD thing where they develop all these specialized, very secret weapon systems. And I remember the Predator drone in the 1990s was being developed, and we got to see an early version of it. And I asked the developers, I said, are you going to put weapons on those things? And they said, oh, no, these are purely for surveillance. Sure enough, a decade later, they have weapon systems on them. So they are a very easy thing to deploy. They're not inexpensive, but they're easy thing to deploy. And in terms of special operators, another little factoid for you is that the United States has more special operators in more countries than we do have diplomats, right? That's a problem. So again, let's go back to diplomacy, intelligence, right? Human, right? Developing our SIGINT, and sort of trying to undermine, our enemies, our rivals, these insurgencies, these terrorist organizations, before they can actually harm us, and require us to have sort of a kinetic response, and getting out in front of it. So I'm not confident that this is the way to go, and the way that we should go is relying on special operators. I don't think it's possible. We don't have enough of them. And second is, I think it's quite dangerous. And also it's impeding our reputation. I mean, the fact that we keep sending in these forces and then all of a sudden civilians are dying, and also some senators and representatives in Congress, they don't even know who's operating where, right? That's a problem, right? That sort of feels like we've got some rogue elements operating in the state, where we don't know actually what our foreign policy and our national security policy is actually trying to do, and with what kinds of weapons and personnel.
I would just add that having studied and worked with soft forces for 20 years, The idea that this counterterrorism force can be deployed in an extended way to challenge different terrorist elements is a interesting aspect of American strategy. The U.S. probably does have soft forces to do this. The question is, and one that we certainly will study through the year, is to what extent you rely on this almost in perpetuity. And can you do it in different parts of the world with small footprints? But that's a complicated question, but one that I think we can spend a lot of time talking about during the year. I saw a hand, let me take one in the very back.
Thank you. That's a question for Professor Toft. So you mentioned that the U.S. power and influence is now seen as diminished around the world. Why do you think that other actors are starting to see U.S. power and influence as impotent?
Can you repeat that last part?
Sorry. Why do you think that other actors around the world are starting to view U.S. power and influence as impotent?
As decreasing?
Yes.
I think because we're heavy-handed. I think we're scary, right? We can go wherever we want. United States, what does the United States have? We have lift capacity, right? Why were the Europeans desperate for us to be in Libya? Because we had lift capacity. We have desalinization, units, right? So the United States can get to most corners of the world relatively quickly and relatively effectively. And the question is should we be doing that? And a lot of the world is now saying no. We are a scary actor. Most states do not want the United States in their backyards, right? Invading the country, occupying the country. And the data from the intervention project, 25% of U.S. interventions have happened, right, in the most contemporary period. Think about that. This is a country that's been around for over 200, years, right? And most of the interventions happen now. And so the question is, we need to take a deep breath, both we as American citizens, but then also the global community. What's interesting is that the global community is saying, wait a second, stop. And what I hope is that American citizens say, why are we doing this? And I love Ayesha, you're right, that what were the alternatives of 9/11, of going in and slapping the Taliban and going after Al-Qaeda? Should we have taken a breath at that moment? Did President Bush have the opportunity? Because there was a strong public outcry to do something to react. But it wasn't only domestic. The international community supported the United States. The territory, the homeland was attacked, and it was justified. It was actually seen as legally just to be able to do that. But what were the alternatives at that moment? And we did not have that conversation as a nation.
I think the conversation should take place now so that you avoid similar mistakes in the future. And I just don't agree. I don't agree that the international community was solidly behind America retaliating the way it did. It would have supported it whole hog if they knew. A lot of people knew that this would not succeed. That there was Afghanistan, we've heard for 1 million times that it's the graveyard of empires, and America was walking into a trap. The same trap that was laid for the Soviet Union. The point is that Pakistan has been the punching bag for Washington's mistakes and failures. But I will say that, when you forget the first 20 years of the war, which made Pakistan's military all powerful and made it impossible for civilians to have a word to change the policy. Now that's when things become impossible. So I think it's important to realize that there are unintended consequences of policies, which may not be entirely domestic, as you point out, but they need to be thought out more carefully when you're committing yourself to that extent, especially a country where the interests of the majority of the domestic population is very little on foreign policy. So who really is backing those wars? You yourself showed with your charts that there is less and less at stake for America, and yet it's still, its interventions are increasing. I think that's what needs to be thought about.
My question to Professor Miller is the one blame that is not good. We blame Biden, we blame the Afghan government for this withdrawal is the Pakistani intelligence, which supported Taliban for 20 years. And right now, I'm from Afghanistan. There's thousands of Pakistan intelligence officers going office to office in Kabul, including the Afghan intelligence, collecting data. People are seeing them. They don't speak even Pashto. Why did the United States fail to make Pakistan accountable for its support? Did the US lost the war to Taliban or to Pakistan? And Professor Toft, who should be blamed in the US side for this bad withdrawal, the actual withdrawal at the end? Not the decision to withdraw, but how it should be done. Biden was given warning by the intelligence community, by the journals. And if you think he should not take the heat, who should take the heat for this incompetency? Thank you.
Let's first start with policy.
Professor Jalal, do you want to start with the question about Pakistan?
I mean, the point that has to be made is that America built up the ISI during the 20 years war that everybody forgets against the Soviet Union. Thank you, Professor Miller, for reminding people that this was not a 20-year war. It's been a 42-plus-year war in which the first 20 years America built up the ISI, which then continued to rule the roost in the country with the help of an all-powerful military and a very emasculated political process with weak political parties who don't really have a say in foreign policy and defense. Who controls the ISI? The military is an all-powerful institution thanks to the United States of America.
So from the perspective of U.S. policymakers, if you put yourselves in the shoes of President George W. Bush, President Obama, President Trump or Biden, and you ask, what do you do about Pakistan, which U.S. policymakers have for 2 decades known have been supporting the Taliban in certain ways, while also describing the relationship with the U.S. as an alliance? It's not an easy question to answer. What would you have done when you get to the point that Professor Jalal described, where the Pakistani military is a dominant force in Pakistan's politics for good reasons and bad? They think that an alliance with the Taliban is important for Pakistan's national security. What options were there for the U.S. to credibly push against Pakistan? If you rewind before 9/11, the main reason Pakistan made it into American conversations about foreign policy was fear that there would be a nuclear crisis, either within Pakistan, the government would lose control of nuclear weapons, or something involving India. And so there was a really widespread sense among American foreign policymakers that you couldn't push Pakistan too hard because it would push towards such a conflict with India, or because the Pakistani state was so weak that it might lose control over its nuclear weapons. Now, maybe that was exaggerated here, but that was certainly a very large part of the U.S. policy conversation. Once you're in the war in Afghanistan, you've got to find some way to attract the Pakistanis to your side. That was the rationale. And it's certainly hard to imagine that you call the Pakistanis your allies, you're going to pressure them away from the Taliban. How does that work in practice? It's hard to think of a policy that would have been more likely to succeed than the one that they tried, which was certainly not very likely to succeed, but probably the best option that they had, given the really uncomfortable place that Professor Jalal described them starting with. I haven't seen anyone articulate a better policy towards Pakistan, even though I've read many damning critiques of what U.S. policy towards Pakistan actually was.
Chris, if the Taliban had not had the Pakistan sanctuary, would we be having this conversation?
Excuse me, could you just repeat that question? I mean,
Sure. My question is this. If the Taliban had not had the sanctuary with all that entailed in Pakistan, would we be having this conversation about the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan today?
I think Pakistan's footprint is undeniable, but I think a bit exaggerated in terms of what they can actually accomplish there. If only, I mean, just remember the Taliban ruled that country for 5 years, and Pakistan's military-dominated state failed to succeed in getting them to agree on the Durand Line as the international frontier. That shows you how little control they have over these so-called clients of theirs. They're there because they have national security interests, which I'm glad to hear Professor Miller acknowledge, because most people think that the Pakistan army are just rogues. They're following their own interest. What's wrong with Pakistan is the civilian-military balance. And that's because of the 20-year war against the Soviet Union, which entrenched the military. So I think, and the ISI. So I think that's the problem that Pakistan faces, that the civilian leadership doesn't have the ability to bring about the shift that's needed in that country.
There's no question that you're correct. The issue I'm raising is the issue of sanctuary. So.
No, but sanctuary. The Taliban. The Ghani government was providing sanctuary, willy nilly, to those elements like the TTP that the Pakistan wants to eliminate, and who are now part of ISIS Khorasan. So I think that there are possible ways to work with Pakistan. And the Pakistan military cannot just, it has to be understood what they have in mind. They have always connected the Afghanistan problem from the very beginning, since 1947, with Kashmir. But since Kashmir is not on your agenda, you cannot get that army to work with you. Why should they?
We should probably take some questions from our Zoom audience. So let me take a couple from them, then I'll come back to you. We have at least 3 more hours. Oh, yeah.
Tough one. So the question was, is Biden to blame for the messiness of the withdrawal? So my first, and he did have intelligence, and the military was going to say it was going to be quite, the military leader said it was going to be quite messy. But I think, yes, it could have probably been done a little bit better. But evacuating, leaving a war is going to be messy. And if you think about it from President Biden's perspective as the commander-in-chief of American armed forces, he's done a pretty good job. 13 service people are dead, 11 Marines, 1 Navy, and 1 Army, right? They had a mission. They did an extraordinary mission, which is they got a lot of Americans out alive. Where the real tragedy, that tragic that 13 died, but the parents of them and their wives and spouses, it was extraordinary what they helped to achieve in getting them down. According to the U.S. government, there are 150 to 200 Americans left. Hopefully we can get them out. The real tragedy is the Afghan side, and that was a systemic failure in the sense of the State Department and being denuded under the Trump administration, special immigration visas. We can go through the whole litany of the inability to deal with and not caring enough to take care of the people who helped us to execute that war. And so that was a systemic failure, and I do hope, some of you are going to go into the State Department, that you have a better State Department to go into, that if we face a situation like this, let's hope we don't, that we are in a better position to take care of those allies and the families of those allies who are now threatened and get them out sooner. And that's where the tragedy was. I think the general evacuation of American citizens, actually, that was quite brilliantly done. As Commander-in-Chief, he did a good job. The other thing is I really find it distressing. I wasn't a huge Biden fan. I shouldn't say that because I want to be part of his administration, but he is actually being one of the few leaders right now. He is taking a leadership role and taking responsibility. So it's really killing me when he's getting so beat up, and that's because of the polarization of the American system right now. And you see, I hate to say the Republicans, right, really going after him when many of them thought we needed to get out. And now they're saying, no, we should have stayed. When the truth is it's the messiness of the evacuation that was the problem. But if you think about it from the American perspective, I'm sorry, I should, he did a very good job, actually. He saved many American lives. It's on the Afghan side of things where the tragedy, and that preceded him. We know that was many administrations not doing the proper work of taking care of the State Department, thinking through how to deal with the allies and friends in Afghanistan who helped us with this effort and what we were going to do once we decided to leave, right? And we had, and Biden sort of had to leave in a sense because he's telegraphing to the Taliban, and under the Trump administration, the agreement, they did not target U.S. servicemen, and had he extended it, it was going to be free reign, and you were going to see American servicemen being targeted. So it's mixed, but I think on the Afghan side, it was a systemic failure, and I'm sorry for that, and I do hope that you didn't lose somebody too precious to you, even though your nation, I know that you're suffering for your nation writ large.
So we have many questions from Zoom. The first by Daniel Kramer. He asks, one of the commonly stated goals of the intervention in Afghanistan, in addition to disrupting al-Qaeda, was nation building. Do you believe that this was indeed one of our goals? And if so, was it ever realistic to think that the United States could build a Western-style democracy in Afghanistan?
Let me say that if you look at the history of the war, I think this whole question of nation building is something that the United States ignored for quite a long period of time because of the Iraq War. Many of the capabilities that could have been employed in that way, and to take advantage of the fact that the Taliban was defeated and really not a fact, had the opportunity to come back. So this nation building narrative, I think, needs a lot of scrutiny to look at it a long time, and how much of a commitment there was on the part of the United States for that. Now, there was a big commitment to nation building and aspects of it from the international community. And so when we look at this question, we have to look at it along timelines and determine, is it really the case that there was a serious commitment to this? And I'll defer to Toft.
No, I think there was a serious commitment to it, and I think there were pockets of, I think from about 2005 to 2017. I mean, look at women got educated, right? They just a whole generation. This is what's kind of really tragic is that we raised all these expectations. We educated a whole generation, Dick, of the population. We did bring in Western institutions and tried to give, one vote. I do remember the first time they voted in the purple thumbs and everything. I mean, there was a sense that people were taking ownership of their country. The problem is that Afghanistan has never been a unified, cohesive nation, and we were trying to impose this centralized form of government on a country that hadn't had a history of this. And it brings us to, the Western state. Maybe there needs to be a different model in Afghanistan. And we were just too, hubristic, thinking that we could export this to the place without listening and reading about the history of this people.
See, what I'm saying though is that this wasn't just a U.S. policy. This was an international policy.
I agree.
And there was a major commitment by many non-governmental organizations to helping Afghanistan achieve these things that you're talking about.
No, that's right. The Italians had the police. Different governments had different aspects to try to sort of govern or help to build a government for this country without really stepping back and saying, what's best for Afghanistan? And here we are, 20 years later, and within 10 days, 20 years of work sort of dissipated.
I'd like to add to that, Dick. Nation building, if you can call it that, certainly was a concern for the allies, the United States. But working with the very militants, the warlords that they had tried to defeat, was a grave error. I mean, you can't sort of build something and then hand it over to the warlords. I mean, that's the story of Afghanistan for the last sort of several years. And it's a tragedy. So I do think that there were conflicting interests. Chris Miller talked about the many conflicts, but I think this was one of the conflicts. I mean, I've had students in my class who served in Afghanistan who said, we just don't know what we were doing there. They don't want us here. So I think it's really tragic. We need to think about this very deeply.
I have one thing.
Oh, yeah, sure.
I think that this is a really interesting discussion because in some ways, I think Professor Jalal's and Professor Toft's comments cut in somewhat different directions. Say if we're trying to impose Western-style democracy would also imply we're not relying on warlords. But certainly we did rely a lot on warlords to cut deals for various regional political leaders, which I think suggests the complexity of what we were trying to do. I tend to side more with Dick on the question of was nation building a U.S. goal. I mean, it seems to me the U.S. devoted most of its resources in Afghanistan to military building, rather than nation building on the grounds that you need to have security before you can have a public sphere emerge. Whether that's the right or wrong social theory, I don't know, but I think that is the social theory that we were talking about in places like this in the early 2000s. That you got to have security, and then you can have everyone go to school, and then politics can emerge. And so I think when you look actually at where the resources of the U.S. went, it went into military building rather than nation building. And I guess this will give us a chance to test some of these social theories looking back, saying, is that the right way to build a state? You start with the army or start with some other institution? But surely that's where the U.S. attention was going.
Well, and I would add, again, I want to stress how much the international community has reflected in many of the non-governmental organizations that had big footprints in Afghanistan were part of this exercise, and it was apparent, especially in education, but not just in education.
I want to slightly challenge you a little bit, Chris, on that comment, because the United States was also building infrastructure, right, and schools and hospitals, and also telling the government of Afghanistan what it could and could not do. So it was more than, yes, you're right. The United States took the reins of building the military and then built a Western military, Western-style American military, but it was also quite concerned in building up infrastructure and the educational system and medical system, and in some ways we delivered on that. Right, particularly in the capital and some of the major regional capitals, but it didn't reach very deep. And part of that is the corruption. We haven't even talked about the corruption, right? All the deals that were being struck in order to get that infrastructure and that building done, we had to strike a lot of nasty deals in order to get America and Western aid flowing in this country.
Let's get another question.
This next question is perhaps more practical, but one that affects many in the Fletcher community. Stephen Campbell asks, there are still hundreds of Americans stranded in Afghanistan, as well as Afghans with special visas, including members of the Fletcher community. What options do you see the United States taking to help evacuate at-risk people and families out of Afghanistan?
Well, the U.S., the Taliban will need resources. And so the way that I think about it is you have to try to make a deal with them and give them things they need as a quid pro quo. Now, whether they're willing to do this, I don't know. But that, when you think about the Taliban, this is an insurgent army. It is not a government, and they're going to face a lot of immediate problems, and those are problems that the U.S. has resources it can contribute to facilitate that. Now, do they want to do that? We don't know about it. We know about the ones we negotiated with Doha. Are they the Taliban? Or how much influence do those that we negotiated with actually have over the real Taliban, which are the ones that do the fighting and the commanders, and the extent to which what their calculus is. So there are things that can be done to deal with the questions that my good friend Stephen Campbell raises, but it will turn on the extent to which the Taliban leadership wants to cooperate with that, or whether they're looking at it as we're in charge and that's that. So these are tough questions.
I'd say it's early days. We don't know yet what the Taliban wants. We know what it needs. It needs money. All of its accounts are frozen. All the aid is frozen. So there's leverage there. Talks are already happening in Doha about opening up the airport again. If the airport opens up, maybe we can get flights in and out. So I think it's too soon to tell. And on top of that, as Dick said, the Taliban themselves aren't united. So who is actually really in charge there? And then, of course, the Taliban have to balance the interests of the other organizations operating, and they can't be seen as currying too much favor with the West, right? They have to get a really good deal, or at least be able to sell a good deal to explain why they're willing to allow some Westerners to continue to get out.
Well, and more importantly, Afghanistan. One more, and then we'll go back to this one.
So we have one question from Nathan Skopach, who was deployed in Afghanistan 3 times and deployed in Iraq 5 times. He asked a question that I think is for you, Professor Shultz. What is the role of counterinsurgency and irregular warfare as an instrument of national power? And how do you recommend we judge the incremental results of this type of warfare?
Yikes. Yikes. Yeah, I can't. But I can say that I think there are many misconceptions about counterinsurgency and where counterinsurgency fits into a policy. So I would use Iraq as an example of where between 2006 and 2010, a combination of counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, the awakening, and the bad behavior of AQR resulted in clearly in a lowering of the level of violence in Iraq. I mean, it's demonstrable. That was necessary, but it was not sufficient because counterinsurgency has to support a policy, a political policy for that nation, and that was always the most difficult thing in Iraq. It was dealing with identity differences, and so there is a place for counterinsurgency. In our terminology, we say it's at the operation, but it is not a substitute for effective policy. Okay? We have consensus here. Let's go back here, please.
Yeah, so I understand that we need to learn the lessons of past military interventions. I also understand what Professor Toft showed us, that part of the decreasing perception of the United States is our heavy-handedness or our hubris. But in a world where we're kind of becoming more engaged in great power conflict, how do you balance the need to almost project strength against our peer competitors with also the perceived need to project strength and then the actual real need to take a step back and think about these decisions before we engage? And then also kind of a secondary question, even if whatever 60% of the US population doesn't think that we need to be the primary power or a great power, what's to say that their lives and their interests wouldn't be affected when we aren't the primary power? So, thank you.
Over to you.
Yeah. I mean, there's this thing called multilateralism. Why do we have to go it alone, right? And so that's one way, is you just work with your allies. Now, the Trump administration did a job on our alliances. And so the Biden administration is trying to have a recovery there, right?
Yeah, how's that working?
Well, now with Biden pulling out, not really telling our Western allies he's pulling out, right? So we've got a lot of work to do. But hey, I'm not on drug policy, so I'm just relaying. But in any event, so there are alternatives to the outright use of force, which is there's other tools, right? You have leverage. So Joe Nye, who's a professor over at the Kennedy School, he talks about soft power. The United States who has a lot of influence in other ways beyond just the use of force. So education. People want to study in the United States. We have one of the best educational systems, starting from undergrad all the way up through graduate school. And you think about not the Taliban, but actually Iran elite. They want to be Western educated. They want to send their children. Well, you can deny that, right? So there's other with the Chinese, right? Many Chinese want to study in the United States, and so you have leverage in other ways beyond the use of force. And yes, you don't necessarily want to compete overtly, militarily. And actually, in the case of China, which is the big peer competitor on the horizon, I don't think the Chinese want to compete militarily. Yes, they're building up their military, but if you look at what they're doing, it's largely economic and creating sort of a connected network of influence. And the United States is sort of letting China do that because I think it's preoccupied in other parts of the world. So what I'm hoping is that if we pull back from Afghanistan, have some reflection on this over-reliance on military might, we might recognize, how is China getting influence? Well, it's getting influence through economics, through the Belt and Road Initiative, right? And signing actually bilateral deals, which other states do not like. And so the United States come in and say, you know what, we would be a better economic partner than China is. So there's other ways to do it. Than just relying on the use of force. Strength, that slide, the very first slide I showed you, power, is changing. It's not just a fist in your face anymore, right? Think about cyber. We have a great cyber program. We just started our master's in cyber. It's very, very disruptive, but at this point we haven't seen it as destructive, right? And so there's other ways in which you can get your way, influence others without necessarily destroying or attacking the other side.
I'd like to add to that, Dick, if I may be allowed to. This conversation and the fact that China has been brought up reminds me of Henry Kissinger's book on China, in which he pointed out that the West tends to go for the kill. And as we've seen in this instance, it misses it often, whereas the Chinese play the long, slow game. With the view of persuading their enemies and rivals to see things through their perspectives. I think that's a lesson that we should humbly try and learn.
Let's go over here, all the way in the back.
So my question is for Professor Miller. As we have seen the United States and United Kingdom kind of withdraw from Afghanistan, we've seen the exact opposite happening with Russia and China. And so my first question is, with Russia's intent to continue formal diplomatic relations with the Taliban, what does Russia have to gain through these relations, and how will this relationship between between Russia and the Taliban impact U.S.-Russia relations?
Thanks. So the question was about Russia and the Taliban. And certainly it's in some ways a kind of surprising turn of events that Russia would be alive with the Taliban, given the history 40 years ago of the opposite alignment in many ways. I think the main goal from the Russian perspective over the past couple of years has been to impose an embarrassing defeat on the United States. And in that sense, Russia feels like it's gotten what it wanted. Pictures of Biden being embarrassed by massive criticism of allies up in arms, even of casualties at the Kabul Air Base, I think, or the Kabul Airport, I think, or something that Russians are happy to see because it shows the U.S. on its back foot. But there is debate, I think, in Moscow about whether this is really a sustainable long-term strategy and what it means for Russia actually to have the Taliban in power, not just today, but in 1 week or 1 year's time. And there's a lot less comfort than I think the excitement about U.S. defeat initially left. The Russian government is well aware that what happens in Afghanistan is likely to spill over into Central Asia, which are countries with which Russia has deep relations and has historically, Tajikistan in particular, has a lot of very complex ties with Afghanistan and will be impacted by what happens in Afghanistan. Tajikistan itself has a very tenuous domestic balance that could well be disrupted, hopefully not, by the situation in Afghanistan. And so I think Russia is trying to assess right now, can the Taliban set up an effective government? It's still far from clear. B, what stripe will that government be? Will it be a government the Russians can work with or not? And C, also trying to ascertain how the regional powers will relate to the new government. What will China do? How will Pakistan do? What will India do? The Russians are in wait-and-see mode on that front, and they're happy to have relations with the Taliban insofar as that means a line of communication. But I don't think the Russians are deluded in any sense that the relationship with the Taliban is likely to be easy, especially since, as of 2 days ago, the only thing that was really uniting the Taliban and Russia was a dislike the United States, and that's no longer that relevant in the case of Afghanistan.
Let's get one more. Yeah.
Hi there, this is just general questions to the panel. So discussion more so on the ethnic composition of Afghanistan. So we had with the Taliban rule awful persecution of the Hazaras. Though I've read in recent years, the Taliban has tried to incorporate in its ranks more Uzbeks and other Tajiks. So what does the policy of the Taliban look like going forward, incorporating these ethnic groups? And what does that mean for the Central Asian republics and across next door into Pakistan? Because those groups also bleed into there.
Well, it's a disaster, is the short answer. Because the Hazaras have been targeted not just for their ethnicity, that's just an excuse. They've been targeted for their land, so that they are removed from their land. It's a land grab. That's what's happening in parts of Afghanistan. That's what's happening in parts of Quetta, which of course housed the Taliban Shura for many, many years. And that's where the poor Hazaras are being attacked. Why? Not because of their ethnicity. Yes, they're Shia, but it's for their land. So I think those are very serious matters, and they'll have implications in the whole region, which is why the American withdrawal for years to come will be looked upon with grave misgivings that the timing was still not right. And I think nobody says that they should have stayed on longer, but perhaps these matters ought to have been taken account of, because I don't see the future of the minorities being at all reassuring.
Please.
So my question is, there is a debate about diplomacy taking a back seat and in American politics, and in decision making, military is making the round. So there is a military decision making. So my question is, if we come back, take this scenario to Afghanistan, do you believe that it is somehow related to like how we failed in Afghanistan in that context?
I mean, this over-reliance, yes, absolutely. I think I started the conversation by making that case that we've overstressed the use of the military over diplomacy. And what I would hope that this is a time of reflection for the United States, but also the global community, right? Because the Western powers, Western allies have gone along with the United States. You can think about Iraq, right, with Blair, Prime Minister Blair, sort of jumping into bed with George Bush and going into Iraq when it wasn't clear. I mean, if you remember that one too, we changed why we went in. First, it was weapons of mass destruction, right? And then it was for humanitarian concerns. And the alliance with the UK under Prime Minister Blair gave a lot of legitimacy to Bush, right? So what I would hope is that we have deep reflection, because they are the great powers. China tends not to intervene. It believes that sovereign nations should be able to do whatever the heck they want, including beating up on their population and minorities. But Western powers, they're quite interventionist, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But I don't think, Ayesha, you talk about the second, third, and fourth order effects. They don't think through the longer term and what the alternatives are. And often I think the reason for that is the United States has taken the lead. I mean, Libya was really one of the first where President Obama, Barack Obama, said, I don't want it. And the French were like, no, you've got to help us out on this. It's like, no, I don't want it. And so the United States ended up getting involved. And as you saw, that became a civil war after that, right? Because we didn't have a clear sense of what we were trying to achieve in that country. Yeah, we were trying to prevent a genocide of part of the population. But after that, what's next? And could we have put more pressure on Gaddafi? I mean, Gaddafi gave up nuclear weapons. This was a guy actually we could have possibly worked with again, but we didn't sort of go through, or would we let diplomacy lapse too much in that case?
We're going to go back to the online part.
Question from Rabia Zafar, directed to Professor Jalal. We started discussing China briefly. She asks, do you think China could play a stabilizing role in the region, especially as it works to protect its investments? And I should add, what risks and opportunities does China see in Afghanistan today?
Well, China only sees economic opportunities, but my own hope is, and it may be a forlorn hope, is that it will be a good element in offsetting the Pakistan military. It's the only element that, the only sort of power that can perhaps really exercise real influence on Pakistan. And I think China in that sense could potentially play a peace-making role. I hope it does so as a mediator and not like the US getting involved. Had the US been able to mediate, things may have been very different in Afghanistan today. But that's another moment. That's a conversation for another time.
Professor Miller, do you want to comment? Okay. And another question from Andrew Lala. He says that there are many scholars who claim that Biden could have chosen a third withdrawal path, not to fully withdraw, as was done, nor to fully ramp up our military presence. Does this idea hold any merit? What would this type of small, long-term ground presence and military advisor support be able to accomplish that wasn't accomplished in 20 years?
Yeah, this is the argument for what's called small or light footprint. And the idea here is that the U.S. And allies would have about 3,000 to 5,000 troops. They would, one of their main missions would be to give the kind of support that was needed to a quite good part of the Afghan military, or the Afghan commanders, so really Afghan Rangers. Think of them as a Ranger force. But they don't have any sustained to like bullets itself. So the argument is like footprint is that would be part of it. Part of it would be and airspace. And then the light footprint would give the U.S. the counterterrorism capability, maintain it in country. And then there would be economic support, assistance as well. What's the end? Is the question that you want to be asking. To what end is this light footprint? And some would argue that the purpose of it is to deal with to deal ultimately with the terrorism threat, which has no end. This is the argument. I'm not advocating this, presenting the contours that you have a now multi-generation extremist, internationalist component that light footprint would help you manage. But again, I raise the question, to what end and how long? Turn to Chris and Monica.
The other thing is the counterfactuals. Would the Taliban have accepted that, or would they have started attacking American servicemen? How would President Ghani, he would have thought, okay, I can keep, dragging on this government and high levels of corruption, and that it gets back to Professor Schultz. To what end? There has to come a point where the United States needs an objective of some kind, metrics to measure whether they're achieving that, and is counterterrorism having that footprint there enough? Are we securing enough national interest? Go back to my last slide. I mean, what is Afghanistan costing us? It's $300 million a day. When we were at 2,500, 3,000 strength, that's a lot of money. Can you imagine what that would do for your education here at the Fletcher School? You could all go to the dean would love that. It's in the down every single day, right? It's not costless. And the question is, somebody here very wisely asked, I think it was this gentleman, who was making the decision? And the thing is that we have civilian control over our military, right? Technically in the United States, and we do. We have a formidable military. It's fabulous. I'm a veteran. I'm very proud of my service, right? But our policy process is broken down, and Congress is not doing the oversight that it's supposed to do. And we as citizens are not prioritizing what I think we should be thinking as what our priorities are, which I believe is our children, which requires us to properly educate them, have them become full-fledged citizens, go to Tisch College, learn how to be a civic activist, engaged citizen, right? And build a better world, right? And we're not making those decisions. We're seeing ourselves removed. A little bit of hope. I think that more Americans are more active politically and more engaged. But I hope that stays with us and that it becomes reflected in our foreign and national security policy. I know it is in this room. We're talking to each other. We are the choir, but what we need to do is push this out to the broader American community, because I'm not sure it's there. Like I said, I'd love to end on an up note, but I am distressed with how much President Biden is getting beat up for this decision, which took real moral character, leadership, and strength to do it. And the 3 preceding presidents were incapable of doing it, and he's done it, and he should be commended for that. And it's distressing that not only Republicans are being hypocritical, but our press is beating him up for this. Yes, it was messy, but every evacuation is messy.
I've been given the signal that we're not allowed to stay till 10 o'clock. I thought we were. This is, as I started with my comments, and as the dean also began, this is the start, really, of a discussion we're going to have all year. There's an enormous amount of complexity in it, and I can think of no better place than to have this discussion and conversation through the year than with all of you. So I'm going to stop. Dean, do you have anything you want to say? No? We're done here?